Welcome, everyone. The presentation will begin shortly. This session will be recorded and will last 60 minutes with about 45 minutes of presentation, followed by time for questions and answers. Please keep your microphone muted during the presentation and turn off your cameras. If you have a question or comment, enter it in the chat during the presentation, and it will be addressed during the question and answer period. You may also ask questions with video during the question and answer portion. All participants in today's event will have access to the recorded version, which will be available within 1 week after the live event. My name is Joshua Gordon, and I will be the moderator for today's presentation. TESOL International Association Speech, Pronunciation, and Listening Interest section is pleased to present this webinar titled Teaching Pronunciation in World English Context, Prosody Matters. Our speaker today is Dr. Huang from Syracuse University. We are very pleased to welcome all of you to this webinar, and now I'll hand it over to our speaker.
Hello, everyone. This is Huang from Syracuse University. So first of all, I'd like to thank you, Joshua, for inviting me to share my research and teaching interest in teaching prosody in the World English context as SPLIS. And it's such an honor, right? And also, I'd like to thank the International Research Foundation for English Language Education for funding my research that I will be discussing in further detail in this webinar. So first, I'd like to provide an overview of this webinar. I'll start with a brief introduction of a theoretical background supported my research. And then I'll talk about what my research adds to the discussion of pronunciation and intelligibility studies. And last, I'd like to provide a few teaching tips based on my research results. So first of all, let's start with some questions. I'd like for you to guesstimate the following question. How many English as a second language or foreign language speakers do we have around the world? So feel free to enter your answer in the chat if you want to have a try, but I'm going to reveal my answer. So according to a study in 2019 by World Economics Forum, there are around 1.5 billion English speakers around the world, but less than 400 million of them speak it as the first language. So there's another projection as well, just to position this discussion. Rose and Galloway in 2019 suggest that by year 2050, the number of English speakers may surpass 4 billion. Of which little more than 500 million will be defined as L1 English speakers. Indeed, you can imagine probably the following situation more often in our daily life. So for example, some speakers may spend a lifetime communicating in English without ever talking to a native speaker in the traditional sense. So the question is, being able to sound like native speakers in the communication doesn't seem to be necessary in this kind of scenario, right? So I'm going to start I'm going to begin this talk by situating pronunciation teaching within its historical context and discussing the gradual shifting paradigm of nativist principle to the intelligibility principle in second language pronunciation research and also teaching. First, from the historical perspective, let's take a look at the development of different varieties of English, coded as inner, outer, and expanding circle Englishes in Cattrall's 1985 model. So the first circle is the inner circle Englishes, which evolves from the UK migration to New World countries, such as USA, such as Australia, Canada, and so on. Speakers from the inner circle countries were traditionally described as speakers of English as a native language and are considered the norm providers in the second language classroom. That is, traditional pronunciation teaching prefers the native speaking models. The second circle was the result of colonization in Asia and Africa and comprises Cattrall's outer circle English speakers. These countries include India, part of Africa, South Asian countries such as Malaysia and Philippines, and these outer circle Englishes start to form their localized features are considered norm developers. And the last circle is described as in different literature as English as a lingua franca, English as an international language, or emerging English, which comprises the expanding circle speaking countries such as many European countries and Asian countries such as China, Japan, Korea, and where English is used as an international language or foreign language. So, following a historical perspective, the goals for pronunciation instruction were aligned with what Levis in 2005 called the nativeness principle, or the pursuit of native-like pronunciation in a foreign language. However, increasing evidence has shown that nativeness principle is not necessary nor attainable. So, for example, many non-native speakers may never have an opportunity to communicate with a native speaker in their entire life. And for another, some learners may never attain a native-like accent. So instead, intelligibility principles seem a more suitable pedagogical goal. Levis 2005 suggests that the intelligibility principle implies that different features have different effects on understanding. Therefore, instruction should focus on those features that are most helpful for understanding and should de-emphasize those that are relatively unhelpful. But the question is, what features are more helpful for understanding and what are not? And particularly, many previous research have focused on examining L2 speakers' intelligibility based on the native speaking listeners' perspectives. In this webinar, we will not look at those features that deem more helpful for speakers to be understood by solely the native speaking listeners. Instead, we will look at this question in the perspective listeners from the World English's context. That is, how listeners who speak English as a first language, a second language, and a foreign language may perceive different varieties of English speech as intelligible. So indeed, researchers have been trying to identify a unified set of pronunciation features promoting cross-varietal English. And in her groundbreaking work on the phonological features of ELF interaction, Jenkins in 2000 identified a core set of phonological features, which she called Lingua Franca Core, that she argued that were critical to mutual intelligibility in interlanguage talk between L2 learners. Overall, there are two types of features, two categories features that are important for mutual intelligibility. And you can see on the left of the screen, there are a group of segmental features that Jenkins deemed most helpful in terms of mutual intelligibility. And overall, consonants are crucial, with exclusion of voiced and voiceless theta, and dark L and rhotic R. The aspiration of word initial voiceless stops. So, for instance, to distinguish pat or bat, consonant clusters at word initial and word medial positions are necessary. That is, the omission of cluster sounds at these positions are most prohibited. And also the long versus short vowel consonants. Of course, since then, there are more discussion in terms of what segmental features are important in terms of mutual intelligibility across different varietals of English, but that's not the focus here. But if you look at, compared to the long list of segmental features that deem essential for mutual intelligibility, the only suprasegmental features that have been considered as essential for mutual intelligibility is the placement of sentence stress or prominence. Since then, there are studies that have shown that suprasegmental features have a great impact on speakers' intelligibility in the World English context, irregardless of listeners' L1 background. So there are studies that has been done on different aspects of suprasegmental features, such as speech rate, pauses, word stress, sentence stress, and tone choices or intonation. And they all have been found with various degree of impact on listeners' understanding of an L2 speech. And for instance, Date 2005 noted that in addition to nuclear syllable issues involving heavy end stress, Singaporean English speakers' narrow pitch range, high level tone, and falling tones all contribute to intelligibility problems for Japanese hearers. TESOL 2005 found that the combination of prominence placement and rising intonation was used by participants to signal the need for feedback in ELF business meetings. Pickering and Littenberg 2009 also noticed that ELF speakers oriented to tone and key choices for negotiating mutual intelligibility. However, not many studies have systematically studied the impact of suprasegmental features on intelligibility, comprehensibility, and accentedness in the World English context. So in observing of the research gap, I'm going to talk about my own research that addressed the issue. So the current research I'm presenting here is derives from my dissertation study, which aims to investigate whether there is a unified set of suprasegmental features that speakers and listeners of World Englishes rely on in order to increase intelligibility and comprehensibility, and also what features are considered as accented. To give you a little bit of description of the speakers and listener background and tasks I have done in the study. But if you are interested in the detail of the study, please refer to my dissertation work. And I think there will be too many details to talk about in this speech. So for speakers, two speakers from three different L1 backgrounds, namely American English, Indian English, and Mandarin Chinese English were presented. Cattru's 3 circles of Englishes are recruited. The speakers were all instructors of the university at the time, and most of them were STEM major instructors who had extensive experience teaching their topic. Also, as I understand the impact of regional differences in L1 on L2 accents, speakers were pre-screened by trained phoneticians to ensure that they did not exhibit strong regional accents and were comparable to the other speakers from the same background. And to prepare for the lectures, which is the speech stimuli, the speakers worked with me on a semi-structured script based on an introductory level topic in their major. And the lecture were recorded in the soundproof facility, and the instructors produced a simultaneous speech based on the script they worked on. And there were 30 listeners from each of the L1 background, from Chinese, Indian, and American listener L1 background, and they did the following listening tasks. First, they finished a transcription task in which they listened to an excerpt of each speaker's lecture and write down the recording word by word. And then they listened to a longer lecture excerpt after listening, and listeners completed a 9-point Likert scale, rating comprehensibility and accentedness for each speaker. And after each of the ratings, listeners spontaneously answered an open-ended question when their memory was still fresh about the judgment. And the open-ended question were designed to encourage readers to reflect on their judgment and what kind of segmental and suprasegmental feature they noticed when they made the judgment. So that's basically the speaker and listener task. So what did we find? First of all, the results show that several segmental features have correlated with speakers' intelligibility. A frequent use of silent pauses, level tones, and high rising tones may contribute to a higher intelligibility. And this result seemed to a little bit contradict to what previous studies have found that which excessive pausing can affect listeners negatively. However, partly due to the nature of data collection using transcription tasks and the fact L2 speech tends to require a little bit more processing time than L1 speech, so it could be possible that frequent pause in L2 speech may give listeners some time to process the speech and have time to write down the word they heard. And also, a frequent use of mid-rise and low-rise tone choices increases listeners' understanding of the speakers. And this result was partially supported by Khan et al. 2012, in which the mid-rising tone was found to possibly predict oral proficiency as well. And then the next was for listener comprehensibility judgment. Particularly, speakers with more mid-rise and low-rise tones were rated more comprehensible. This result seemed to agree with study on the discourse functions of tone choices, as the use of rising tones in instructional contexts is believed to convey the pragmatic meaning that speakers are oriented towards their listeners and also negotiating background knowledge. In addition, a faster speech rate, articulation rate, and pace would ease listeners' processing difficulty, hence higher comprehensibility, similar to what previous research has found. And lastly, prominence that carries information structure, such as new and old contrast, have received listeners' attention with judging speakers' comprehensibility. And let's take a look at some of the qualitative comments on the features that listeners relied on. So I'm not reporting the segmental features here. I'm only interested in the suprasegmental and see what exactly the listeners have paid attention to. And the first one I want to talk about is the rhythm and stress. So regarding rhythm and stress, first, more listeners have reported issues with rhythm and stress that contribute to their lower proficiency reading, especially with Chinese speakers, regardless of the listeners' L1 backgrounds. Among the comments, rhythm has been frequently brought up that non-native rhythm production is viewed as lower speaker comprehensibility. For example, one of the American English speakers, listeners commented on the Chinese speaker Huang, saying that his rhythm made it hard to understand and his accent. And also, another finding is that unnecessary or lack of sentence stress have been reported by listeners to impede comprehensibility. Just like one speaker said, she doesn't emphasize the important points either. Just like typewriting, it just goes on and on. And another one says, she has some emphasis on some words, so it was easier to follow than the Indian guy. Okay, so these are some of the listener reflection and account of their judgments. The next, in terms of speaking rate and fluency, it has been noted that Mandarin speaking listeners reported more focus on these features compared to Indian and American listeners. More specifically, listeners have an overall positive view towards slower speech rate by non-native speakers, cited that pronouncing words slowly can help with understanding, Or if the speaker spoke fast, they suggest a loss of comprehensibility. One of the speakers says, one of the listeners says, her speed is relatively slow and she's trying to pronounce every word properly. And another person said, slower than normal speech rate. If the first sentence I heard was that slow, I would understand that one better. And in addition, inappropriate placement of pauses between words and incomplete thought group have been reported by the listener to impede comprehensibility judgments. As one said, she is very easy, but sometimes in between pauses, she's not taking much pauses in where the comma and period should occur. Okay, so that's one of the counts. The next one is comprehensibility and intonation. Again, Mandarin speaking listeners comment overwhelmingly more than other listeners on intonation patterns and comprehensibility. One pattern emerges was that a lack of intonation or overtly falling intonation may lead to reduced comprehensibility. For instance, listeners believe that the flat intonation makes it hard to grasp the important content. Just like the second example, his intonation is a little flat, and it makes it hard to grasp the important content. And also, some listeners believe that the loss of comprehensibility is caused by the boredom or annoyance brought by a lack of intonation changes, as you can also see here. Intonation and rhythm of the speaker was annoying. So this is one of the Indian listeners commenting on the Chinese speaker. So let's move on to the suprasegmental features and the judgment of accentedness. When it comes to the correlation results, there is a strong correlation between listeners' accentedness judgment and the use of rising tone, speech, rate, indices, and prominence. Similar to the features that listener relied on in their comprehensibility judgments. But when you look at the qualitative accounts, we see slightly different pictures. That is, listeners have actually made fewer comments on the suprasegmental features when they make the accentedness judgments. Also, it seems that listeners have associated certain features of suprasegmental features with speaker identity. So let's take a look at some of the comments that are received during the open-ended questions regarding the accentedness. Rhythm and stress have received more frequent comments from both outer and expanding circle listeners, but not as much for native speaking listeners. Listeners associate rhythm with the modeled Englishes or geolocation the speakers, actually. For instance, the rhythm tells she's a Chinese, like chopping words. Also, this time, the number of prominences or sentence stress have received more attention in the accentedness rating. Listeners from all three circles have commented on too many stress in a sentence could be an indication of accent. So one of them says, speaker is not the native English speaker. She is stressing on each and every word which can differentiate her accent. The next, I'm going to talk about speaking rate and fluency and accentedness. In terms of speaking rate and fluency, Indian speakers seem to have received more comments on why they were rated most accented based on the speech rate and fluency factors. Overall, based on the listeners' comments, placement of pauses become a stronger indicator in this category for accentedness rating. For instance, listeners cited either no pauses or placing pauses between words as a sign of accentedness. So for example, good accent, but took long sentence to pause. And another is slow speech rate was rated being accented. For example, even she tried to pronounce as much slow as she can and want to clear speak, but it will expose her accent. Okay. The last but not the least in terms of intonation and accentness rating. So intonation was the least commented suprasegmental features by listeners to affect their accentness rating. Nonetheless, the lack of fluctuation in intonation indicate the existence of an accent from some listeners. For instance, one speaker directly commented on how the lack of intonation indicate their non-native status, such as in example 3. His intonation doesn't have much of change, it's flat, he sounds like a Korean. Okay, so another one is seems like there are some intrinsic linguistic stereotype associated with certain intonation patterns. For example, in the first example, she's the best so far. She sounds like native speakers from Western country, and she sounded highly educated judged from her speech rate and intonation. Her job is probably in education or customer service, baby care. It seems that she really cares about communication. She sounds patient. Her stress was normal. Okay, so this is basically what the result comes down to. What do we gain from the results in terms of pronunciation teaching in the world English context when there are different varietals of English, speakers of different varietals of English involved? There are suprasegmental features that listeners rely on in order to understand speakers from different varieties of English. And they fall into 3 big categories. One is prominence or sentence stress, and the other is pause, and the last one is intonation. Also, speech rate is not listed here because it's something that requires practice and can be eventually achieved. So any questions so far, everybody? If you have any question, feel free to send it to Joshua through the chat before I move on to the teaching tips. All right, so next, what should we teach? I will address the 3 aspects that I have just mentioned in the following sections, namely prominences, pauses, and intonation, and provide you some teaching tips. So first is prominence, also have been referred as primary stress or sentence stress in different literature. One of the typical issues with learners that we can see is that they tend to place too many prominences in a single thought group. And this has been an observation with many of my international students that I currently teach as well, regardless of their proficiency level. So how should we approach it? First, a typical approach is by raising students' awareness of how prominence reflect information structure and work with the discourse examples to show them that. And traditionally, sentence stress or prominence has been taught on sentence level. However, information are not contained just within sentence, right? But longer discourse level. So working with longer stretch of discourse help learners to realize that the same words in a sentence can be stressed or not stressed, depending on whether they provide any important information within the discourse level. Huang in 2004 also suggests that we should use longer pieces of discourse and focus practice to produce and place primary stress, preferably using students' own discourse, such as conversations and oral presentations. I would talk a little bit more about how to incorporate teaching prominence with pauses in longer stretch of discourse and give you some examples of actual teaching exercise that I have done in a few more slides. But first of all, let's take a look at a few examples that I have encountered in the ITA discourse and what kind of information we should be paying attention to and what we should be pointing out to our learners. So a useful starting point of teaching prominence is to ask a student to think about, what is thought group, right? What is the typical structure of a thought group, as it comprises about 3 to 7 words and contain only 1 or 2 prominence. And that's something that I always tell my students, the less is more sometimes. And also we want to make sure that they know that it reflects the semantic and syntactic chunks of language, such as phrases or clauses and single ideas. And the next basic rule that I often emphasize is that the number of prominence depends on how much information, important information, the speaker is including in a thought group. The more important information contains within the unit, the more prominence are likely to be presented. But information that the speaker thinks the hearer understand already is usually not made prominent. So this is where the water gets a little murky. It all depends on the context, right? So that's why we say we should teach prominence in a longer stretch of discourse. And for example, if the information has been mentioned in the previous thought group, is it considered old information in the next thought group? Then should we stress the same word that appeared twice? Right, so this is one consideration. Or if there's a contrast information, even if it has been mentioned in the previous context, should we stress it again? So it's all about context and what kind of information you're trying to present to your listeners. I'm going to show you some examples from the ITA data I have collected, and I would like you to pay attention to the first example first. Worth noted that in traditional Englishes, prominence is realized with heightened pitch, volume, and length on the designated prominent syllable. Let's first listen to the speaker.
When a force acts on an object, the object undergoes a displacement. When a force acts on an object, the object undergoes a displacement.
So the first example, it sounds a little interesting, right? So in this example, the first thing you may notice that the way the prominence are produced for the Indian English speaker is a little bit different. So the speaker made a dip of volume at object to show the stress, and it corresponds to Pickering and Whitshire 2000 findings that Indian speakers produce prominence by a dip in pitch on prominent syllable where a pitch peak would be expected and irregular volume changes. And also, the speaker have a shorter thought group, as you can see, that where the double slashes are marked as where the boundary of the thought groups are. So hence it could have been perceived either have not much of stress at all or too many stress at once. So depending on your perception. Also, I'd like you to pay attention again to the highlighted thought group. The second object is stressed, even if it's considered an old information. So what would be a more intelligible way to produce this information, right? So I have put a suggestion here. Well, and of course, everybody is feel free to, try it yourself. How would you produce the prominence in this particular example? So the force acts upon an object. The object undergoes a displacement. So since the second object is an old information compared to when it's in the first thought group, that we tend to not stress it, right? Another example of Indian English speaker from my study is this Indian ITA talking in a biology class. Traditional English use stress to signal contrastive information. However, let's first listen to the example.
Today we'll talk about the differences between DNA and RNA. Today we'll talk about the differences between DNA and RNA.
Okay, so you notice that the way I transcribed it, I only capitalized the DNA and not the RNA. That's a reflection of how she uses her stress pattern as well. You notice that she's not really trying to make a contrast between the differences between DNA and RNA, right? What would be the more intelligible way to produce this information? Feel free to think about that. Going back to my research findings, listeners have reported adding too many stress, not having enough stress, or lack of contrast in new and old information having been reported by listeners from different varieties of English as impeding the comprehensibility. So we definitely should focus on this particular suprasegmental feature in our teaching. So the next one is pauses. Pause is another important component in the thought group, and typical learner issues could include pause patterns with highly unpredictable pause placement and length, which is often viewed as disfluency. Okay, the best way to work with students is to work with different discourse genres, such as monologues, conversations, and the more you practice, the better they are at, right? And based on different student proficiency levels, we could employ, for example, read aloud short passages from authentic discourse for lower proficiency learners, or give presentations with varied lengths for students with higher proficiency level. So I'm going to present you an example of such erratic placement of pauses, and I'm going to ask you to think about where would you pause in order to make your information more intelligible, okay?
The urban growth refers to the absolute number of people living in areas classed as urban. They are particularly in terms of historical perspective. And from the historical perspective, the urban people growth pretty fast, right? So that's the difference.
Okay, so this is an example of the speaker. So of course, it would be difficult to handle the erratic pause by itself, right? And ignore the other essential component of thought group, that is prominence. So what I would normally do is with my student, a typical lesson start with the introduction of what is a thought group or tone unit, and introduce the basic rules of the two crucial elements of thought groups. And then depending on students' communication needs, I select different discourse genre for them to practice. In the past, for my international teaching assistants, we typically start with reading aloud of teaching discourse transcripts. Some of them are actually, there are textbooks that would provide that kind of, transcripts. And in this step, I would sometimes write the transcript without any thought group. So as you can see on the screen on the bottom, transcript provided to learners. That's something that they typically work with. So they have to mark the thought group boundary and also underline the sentence stress. That's what they first do. And this is more for controlled exercises. And then once the student get a better grasp of the idea, then I'd ask them to work with a teaching demonstration and record their production. So this is where a lot of the diagnostic assessment come in with the TAs, if they understood the concepts and if they were able to use the idea of thought groups and prominences in their teaching. And generally, we would pick out part of speech that is typical or problematic in terms of both the placement of the stress and also pauses, where and then we'll work on those parts one by one. And for my undergraduate level classes, and I don't normally anticipate them to give presentations yet. I would ask students to start with a transcript speech. For example, TED Talk is one of those resources I have been using. Of course, I would pick out the topics and the difficulty levels of the TED Talks based on the student need. And then I ask them to work on identifying thought group boundaries and pause placement and where the words that carries important information structure should be stressed. Then I ask them to shadow the recording of the transcript. So this is something that I would do with my students, when I try to teach them how to do stress and pause at the same time to increase their intelligibility. The last one is intonation. One of the research finding is that listeners generally are sensitive to the overall overuse of falling tone or sounding flat when they judge speakers' comprehensibility. So what should we do? Pickering remarked that the use of rising and falling tone to signal information structures are more transparent than those marks the interpersonal functions. So we should definitely be teaching those instead of trying to, talk about the effective and functions of intonation. One of such example is that there is cross-linguistic similarities in the use of falling intonation to express completeness and rising intonation to express incompleteness. Therefore, we should prioritize information functions of intonation as such. And one of the teaching tips is to use information gap tasks that focus on information purposes, completeness, check for comprehension or clarification, or negotiation for understanding. So I'm going to present you some examples in which different information functions are used in the intonation. The first example is the Chinese speakers overusing falling tone when information is not completed. Okay, so I'm going to play the recording here.
The gradual increase in the proportion of the people living in urban areas and the ways in which each society adapts to this change.
Okay, so you can see that where I have highlighted the downward arrow is the falling tone. So each society adapts to this change. Obviously, if you think of how you would normally communicate, this information is not complete, right? So in this case, we could either use a rising tone or a level tone in order to signal that your information is not completed. Another thing is teachers should emphasize the importance of fixed expressions with clear composition meanings. Some examples including rising intonation used paired with formulate comprehension checking expressions to signal clarification and negotiation for comprehension. So the example, I couldn't really find any good examples in my own data because we don't have a lot of negotiation when it's monologue. So I have used example from Pickering 2009 to demonstrate what I mean by this, by using rising tone to signal clarification and comprehension. So Turkish speaker said it's rectangular right. You have a carpet right. So this is an example of such use of intonation to signal information. Okay, so to sum up, here's a cartoon about itchy feet complaining about how Thai language has intonation that is overly complicated while English does not. And other itchy feet, of course, taught him a lesson about English tones for different communication purposes. Of course, disclaimer here, we do not want to confuse our learners with all types of intonation choice that ever exist in English, right? One example is there was a book published that lists over 100 intonation patterns of English depending on effective use. You wouldn't imagine telling your learners that they have to learn all the different ways how tone works in English. So in general, my point is that yes, prosody is important. It carries information structures in a long stretch of discourse, and it helps learners understand the speakers better. And also, it should be made abundantly clear that all the suprasegmental features I have discussed in this webinar are based on the premises of intelligibility. So what does, to sum up again, what are the pedagogical implications? Okay, suprasegmental features are also important. So they should be included in the pronunciation instructions. However, teachers should be selective in terms of what suprasegmental feature they're teaching. Was it for intelligibility purposes, or is it to trying to get rid of an accent? And what kind of suprasegmental features are more important compared to the others? And lastly, who your learners are. So thank you very much for listening to my webinar, and feel free to connect with me through my LinkedIn, and also email me through my email. And last one, shameless plug, I'm going to introduce the wonderful resource book that I have used, that is Discourse Intonation by Dr. Pickering. All right, thank you very much, everybody, for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mei-Chin Huang, for a wonderful presentation. And we will see now if there are questions from our participants. Feel free to type your questions.
Thank you, Marietta.
Or use audio as well.
Question.
Okay, first question.
Let
me see. Okay, so we have one question here. And it says, for the urban growth example, wouldn't it be better to ask the students to make the definition of urban growth shorter and clearer first?
That is a very good question. I think I agree with you on this matter. So, there are different ways you can handle the situation. So what I typically do, I'm not addressing, any of the teaching content yet. What I start with is treating the pronunciation as its own case. And just based on the scenario that has been given, or provided the speech that has been given by the student, how can we fix it? All right, because we cannot really, sometimes we can teach the teaching strategy for sure, but sometimes, whether the student adopt the teaching strategy is another different story. So we treat it on the case, more like a micro level first before we talk about the teaching. I hope that answers your question. I'm not sure. Thank you.
Any other questions? Let's see. I do have one thing that came to my mind is I've heard teachers in EFL context saying that they usually adopt a model of pronunciation, either American pronunciation or British pronunciation or Australian, depending on how close their country is. In many cases, depending on geographical location. And in many cases, I know that some of these suprasegmental features, it might be different. What would be your suggestion, or what would you say for teachers who claim this? Would it be more useful to use a more international, more English as a lingua franca approach? Or what would be your thoughts on this?
Well, that is such a deep question that I'm not even sure that I have an answer for.
Mhm.
There has been a lot of pushback on what kind of model should we use in the classroom. We actually had a chapter discussing this particular issue. If you look at, the chapter that I have co-authored with Lucy on this, a lot of practitioners are actually, pushing back on this idea of whether we should have an international variety, right? And, it can be looked at on two, for me, at least on two different levels. One is the status, right? What is considered privileged in the classroom, right? A lot of people still consider the native variety being privileged, and they're considered they're thinking about the repercussion that they receive if they tell the student that, oh, we're not going to teach you the native to be sounding like native, right? So that's one of the issues. And the other one is, of course, a little bit more practical on the level of pedagogy, right? Because it's like a shifting target, maybe you're talking to one person today and you find that, this feature, it could cause intelligibility issue. And the other day you talk to someone else and there is another feature that could cause intelligibility issues. So it's a difficult issue to solve by itself by identifying a unified set of pronunciation features, in suprasegmental feature, of course, included itself. Yeah. So I try my best, but I don't know
Absolutely.
if that's
Thank
to
you.
answer your question.
Any other questions from our participants? Well, it looks like there are no more questions. So this brings us to the conclusion of today's webinar, Teaching Pronunciation in World English Context, Prosody Matters. A very special thank you to our presenter, Dr. Huang. And this concludes the webinar. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, everybody.